Hi everyone, my name is Enes and I'm happy to welcome you to Tactics and Practice, the series of conferences that Aksioma organizes every year since 2010 in Ljubljana. This year we host the 8th edition of MoneyLab, the international network of artists, designers, activists and geeks who experiment with forms of financial democratization. Initially, the conference was supposed to take place last March in the premises of Kinoshishka, but due to the pandemic, we have transformed it into a series of regular streaming events that take place every Monday at 5 p.m. Central European Time at aksioma.org/moneylab8. Today, we are here for Blockchain Radicalising the Social Imagination, the first of two panels we will dedicate to blockchain. Like many technologies, the radical potential of blockchains and cryptocurrencies to revolutionize the way we work, trade, cooperate, and exchange has narrowed as major banks, corporations, and other powerful interests claim this potential for themselves. In an era where blockchains are being used for the purpose of increasing corporate power, of consolidating inequality, and for new forms of surveillance and exploitations, are other blockchain futures possible? This is the core question we are going to ask to our guest today, writer and researcher Jaya Brekke, author of the B9 Lab Ethical Training Module for Blockchain Developers and the Satoshi Oath, the media theory and digital art researcher, curator and practitioner Martin Zeilinger, and Max Haiven, Canada Research Chair in Culture, Media and Social Justice at Lakehead University in Northwest Ontario. He is the author of numerous books, the latest of which, Revenge Capitalism, was published just recently by Pluto Press. The panel will be moderated by researcher and project coordinator at the Institute of Network Cultures, Inte, Gloerich. But before we begin, please allow me to remind you to use the web chat on our website to share with us your comments and questions during the debate. Towards the end of the session, we'll make sure that some of them will be posed to our guests on your behalf. Jaya, Max, Martin, Inte, thanks for accepting our invitation. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Yannis, for this introduction. And thanks everyone at Aksioma for organizing this creative and resilient edition of the MoneyLab series. Not even a pandemic could stop you. It's so important to keep the conversation going in these extraordinary times and to really, as it happens, see what kind of new urgencies arise and talk about, for example, what we're going to talk about today. So welcome everyone, also from me, to this second to last event in the MoneyLab 8 series. Today we will be talking about the politics and economics of blockchain technology and the possibility of grassroots monetary innovation. What could that be like? So in the past decade, blockchain was pulled from left to right and back again to solve what seems like any issue or to achieve any dream, from libertarian anti-state cryptocurrencies and new realms of monetization to platforms for commoning and cooperative organizing. So much like the internet before it, we're now seeing the blockchain kind of evolving into what might become a kind of general purpose technology, albeit still experimental and speculative. So this, of course, makes it all the more important to investigate what kinds of social, political, and economic worlds it can support. Is the blockchain useful if we want to break open the social imagination, or is it in the end only capable of confirming the status quo? Can blockchain technology help us imagine and work towards a more equitable, open, and flexible world? How are we entangled with others, the natural world around us, and the ledgers that keep track? So who benefits from blockchain and other financial technologies? And what kinds of alternative economies can we achieve with them? What does real resistance look like? And what is innovation from below? So these are some of the central questions for today's panel. And as a kickoff to what will mainly be a discussion, I think, we'll first hear the speakers introduce their ideas. And we'll start with Jaya, who will talk about the political economic possibilities of the blockchain. Then we'll move on to Martin, who has a conceptualization of how blockchain might actually go against the status quo. And Max will share thoughts on what true radical innovation might look like. And after the panel discussion, we'll hear questions from the audience. So first up, Jaya Klara Brekke. Jaya is a researcher at Durham University and investigates the political economy of the blockchain. So in her work, questions of authority, economics, control, and power in decentralized technologies are central. In this presentation, she looks at the blockchain's lineages to hacker culture, peer-to-peer networks, and cypherpunk. What have we forgotten along the way about these cultures? And what could remembering their central values offer blockchains of the future? Off to you, Jaya.
Thank you very much. So just to say that this, so first of all, this kind of brief intervention is comes out of a paper that I'm currently writing and nearly done with for a journal called New Political Economy. And the motivation really for writing this was, it seemed to me that, I think a lot of us had kind of like seen the early days of the blockchain scene and how it brought together such a weird mix of political and ideological perspectives. And it seemed to me that in this mix, there was nevertheless like some kind of common motivation, some kind of common sensibility that was emerging, or that made it possible for these people to be in the same space. And more I kind of I've come to the conclusion that in terms of the motivations for why a lot of people who are developing blockchains start to engage with economics, those motivations tend to be similar and tend to come from a kind of longer history of decentralization and hacker culture that is just slightly different than, strictly speaking, a kind of like history of political economy proper. And so the paper is a little bit a response to the idea that everything has been co-opted and blockchain is necessarily always neoliberal. But to kind of say that there's something else going on. There's a broader set of motivations. There is this kind of character that I try to describe as the hacker engineer. The hacker is a kind of persona that likes to kind of pick things apart, likes to open up the way that systems operate, and to kind of actively take part in transforming those systems for their own purposes, for the fun of it, or for more kind of ideological purposes, which is kind of particular kind of like approach to systems, and I would also say particular kind of approach to economics. And then the engineer that is, again, more concerned with how to make things kind of work for specific purposes rather than kind of an affiliation to a kind of like economic ideology proper. But I had some slides that, let's see, are they coming up? Yes, they're coming up. Right. So this is the title of my talk. Let's see. Yeah, so basically, the crux of the argument is that there is a kind of shared sensibility that I describe as this persona of the hacker engineer, where the affiliation really is to the capacity of decentralized networks and the capacity of cryptography to kind of withstand attacks by authorities, be they governments, corporations, or otherwise. And I think the kind of hacker engineer approach to economics is somewhat similar to a little bit what we're seeing as kind of in the field of like market design. So there is like a little bit a kind of like affiliation to the idea that markets and networks are kind of like design spaces where we can kind of like articulate a set of possible behaviors, and like the ones that kind of tend very much towards the type of neoliberal Hayekian political economy that a lot of critics, immediately box blockchain into, is this idea that, by creating this design space, we found a kind of solution to the problem of politics altogether, right? So we could design a kind of perfect market, we can design a kind of perfect network where the incentives are kind of like modulated in the right way to get rid of political and economic problems altogether. But I would say that although there's a kind of tendency in that direction, there is a lot more going on. this image is a midnight image that I took in London. I took a cycle ride through lockdown London, and I thought it was quite stunning. This is Piccadilly Circus, and it just, for me, this is like, here's a design space, right? Here's a set of infrastructures, and it's empty, it's uninhabited. But yeah, so, you know, there's always been quite a kind of close relationship between computation and economics as disciplines since at least, you know, the kind of World Wars and definitely Cold War. And, you know, kind of political economic theorists and historians have kind of traced how economics had a kind of computational turn, let's say, where, you know, in the kind of like famous Austrian school, Hayekian economics, you know, markets were understood as kind of information processors more than anything else, right? And so you can kind of see this close relationship between economics and computation. But I guess what I'm saying is, like, what we're seeing right now is a kind of economic turn in computation rather than a computational turn in economics. And the difference, you know, is subtle but important, because what that means is that the focus is primarily on trying to kind of create certain types of computational systems, which means that there is actually also more scope for a broader kind of economic agenda than just a kind of like neoliberal Hayekian agenda. And that's important to hold on to. So, you know, a little bit this work that I'm doing right now is also a kind of attempt to open up some political space, let's say, and say that, you know, that political space is actually inherent in the kind of like the cultural histories of blockchain technology and decentralized engineering, especially. And so coming to that, you know, in terms of the kinds of economic motivations of hacker engineers, in terms of the reasons for why they engage in economic activities in the first place, like, you know, so you know, crypto economics, for example, you know, here we have a set of kind of economic ideas that get employed in order to kind of incentivize people, but the primary aim, you know, is on infosec and information security engineering. Information security engineering vocabularies are the ones that tend to get used, you know, in describing what's going on here. You know, but there's kind of like let's say pre-Bitcoin, pre-blockchain histories that I think are super important to also bring to bear in the discussion, that really have to do with what decentralized networks have been good for in kind of hacker experiences in the past. And a lot of that has to do with, you know, whether or not these networks are able to withstand attacks, right? So whether or not these networks, so this idea that, you know, when you have a decentralized network, there is no authority that can shut down the network, even though they might attack, or even though they might arrest a hacker, even though they might shut down a server. It kind of is resilient towards authorities. And this has been a kind of like important, you know, grassroots political tool in many ways. As well as a kind of more, you know, Lulz tool and a more kind of like, you know, just a practical tool. You know, BitTorrent has been around for a long time. And then, you know, cryptography. So, you know, what I'm saying is that there's like really these two main elements: an affiliation to decentralized networks and an affiliation to cryptography amongst this kind of figure that I'm trying to draw. You know, both of which are able to create spaces, you know, online digital spaces that are determined by the people that run them, right? And here's a quite an important change that I think has happened in the kind of history, and when kind of blockchain came along. You know, there's two important moments. So first, you know, Bitcoin, you know, to draw out some of the kind of like alternative or other reasons for why people, you know, not on the right wing, not kind of in it with a neoliberal perspective on things, were excited about Bitcoin, was this idea that, like, okay, so we have decentralized networks and we have cryptography, and that's been kind of useful as a strategy to kind of like keep projects alive and so on, and, you know, as censorship resistance and so on. But what Bitcoin enables is for these networks to also become economically autonomous. And that was quite exciting for a lot of people. And, you know, there's a really wonderful paper by Lana Schwartz who describes, she describes a tendency in early Bitcoin as infrastructural mutualism. So this idea that we have a decentralized network contributions to running that network is remunerated in an equitable manner. These were some of the kind of ideas that many people were and still are quite excited about in terms of adding, economic tools to the development of decentralized networks. And so, I think that's quite important to draw out. That's quite important to elaborate, especially now. So that was one moment, and then the second moment that happened was, I would say around the time of Ethereum, when blockchain became something that was not just about cryptocurrencies, but something broader. And to my mind, something interesting happened there where, the idea of networks as being kind of, let's develop an autonomous network, and autonomy in those circumstances means autonomy for the people and the communities that run those networks vis-a-vis very specific authorities for very specific purposes. When kind of the idea of blockchain was generalized, I think the idea of an adversary was also generalized. And so because the adversary could be anyone, and kind of the political aspect of trying to define a community vis-a-vis and protect the community vis-a-vis certain authorities or under certain circumstances, that was kind of like dropped from the picture. And the idea of autonomy became actually a generalized idea that has more to do with automation. So it became something that, instead of it being autonomy for the people running their own infrastructures, it became autonomy for the infrastructure itself, an autonomous infrastructure as such. And that autonomous infrastructure, is because it's run by mathematics, because it's run by algorithms, then it's and because it's run by code, it's more incorruptible. And this is, obviously a story that, lots of people have kind of critiqued in the blockchain space. But what I'm trying to say is that that's an important moment, but there was something else happening also before, and there's something else that's still possible there, where we understand autonomy more as a kind of as self-determination. And then privacy. Privacy has been something that's been quite important for, pre-Bitcoin internet subcultures like cypherpunk, or internet political movements like cypherpunk. And I think, that emphasis on privacy is, from, in terms of political economy, actually a super interesting lens that tends to be kind of overlooked a little bit too much, especially when we look at the way that digital network economies operate today. There's, and when I say digital network economies operate today, I'm talking about a kind of surveillance-based platform economies and so on. Inte, how much time do I have left?
I think like a few minutes, like 2 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. So, cryptography and decentralization, and then, this kind of experimentation with economics where, the motivations from the perspectives of hacker engineers is really about the ability to create autonomous, self-determined networks. And, the interest, or the kind of, the primary interest has been on, information security problems, on computer engineering problems, and so on. So, okay, there might not, always be, a super critical understanding of economic dynamics, and there's a kind of, people draw on a lot of different economic theories without necessarily historicizing where they come from and their effects. But there is, super interesting blockchain projects that do also operate with much more this infrastructural mutualist, mutual credit type approach that has more to do with equitable accounting within a decentralized network than it has to do with kind of free market ideology as such. And I think a good way to kind of contextualize that, or a good way to kind of make that more concrete and more specific, is, to kind of understand, the political economy of hacker engineers very much vis-a-vis the cloud, cloud infrastructures, and understand it as a kind of like response to the centralization of infrastructural control that the cloud created or enabled, and the kind of, or that was the consequences of the cloud, let's say, and the surveillance-based business models that were enabled by the cloud. and the centralization of data and value that's come about as a result. And here, you know, I really do think that the kind of sensibility of the hacker engineer is actually extremely relevant as a counter to, you know, the developments of you know, centralization under the cloud. Not just the emphasis on decentralization, which you know, is super kind of fluffy, and is, you know, the way decentralization is used in the blockchain space is very random, but when you draw it, when you take it to its like very specific computer engineering and hacker histories, it has very specific kind of genealogy and meanings that I think are much more pertinent. So, you know, decentralization, cryptography, and the emphasis on privacy, the emphasis on self-determined infrastructure, you know, these things are actually have only become more important. And really, you know, the interesting thing about privacy is that it opens up, you know, this isn't privacy just in the sense of like, oh, I have the right to have a kind of like personal private life, although that's part of it. It's also a kind of very important collective dynamic here in terms of it forces, first of all, for there to be different business models that are not based on data extraction, you know, and it forces for there to be, it forces the potential for a kind of different interaction with things like machine learning and whatever else. So privacy really, or encryption really, has a lot to do with being able to kind of self-determine your own presence and your community's presence in kind of online digital networks, and take back some of that control, let's say, to determine those contexts and situations. That's pretty much my intervention. Yeah, this is look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that you gave us really needed kind of a reconceptualization of what the blockchain is. There's so much talk about all the kind of the implications that it has and the political leanings of the technology or the people involved in the technology. And to have a good conversation about it, we need this kind of to understand what you just talked about. So I will save my questions for after the three presentations. I just want to give a quick reminder for the audience that you can keep writing your questions in the chat. You can see the URL on the screen. We will collect them, and at the end of, or towards the end of the event, we will ask some of the questions that were there. So keep doing that as we go on, and not at the end, so that we can collect them properly. On next is Martin. So Martin Zeilinger is a media theory and digital art researcher, practitioner, and curator of the Vector Festival and Neon Festival. And Martin also was the lead organizer for MoneyLab 4 in London in 2018. So this is a switch of roles right now. Today, Martin explores how blockchain technology could be used for not fixing property-based value systems, but for refusing such systems entirely. Instead of financializing creative practice and further commodifying aesthetic artifacts, can crypto resist property as such? How might an unownable digital artifact function on the blockchain? Martin.
Okay, here I am. Thanks to Aksioma, first of all, everyone there for making this happen and for seeing this through in this very, very difficult circumstances. And also thanks to everyone at Institute for Network Cultures in Amsterdam for kind of their ongoing commitment to MoneyLab as a bigger thing. A lot of what Jaya was just talking about really resonates, I think, with my thoughts on the subject as well. And I think there'll be great continuity for conversation in the discussion part of this later on. And so what I'll maybe try to do in the next little little bit of time is maybe ground the discussion in some quite specific examples. The series of questions that Inte just outlined from my abstract, I make no promises about answering any of them. I kind of want to repose and unpack them a little bit more. Some of these questions I have no answers to. Some of these questions I have answers to, but I think they're the wrong answers. But I think they can frame some of this discussion about the critical potential of blockchain technology implementations and the responses to them quite well. So a lot of the work that I do focuses on intellectual property issues in relation to contemporary art, and so that really also frames my comments here, my commentary here as well. If we can skip over to the slides, there'll be a few examples on there that might help me speed things up as well. So the background for my discussion really is, on the one hand, this idea that the blockchain promises these disruptions of finance or even of capital in a more abstract sense. But in the last few years, in particular, theory and practitioner communities are realizing more and more that actually, this promise of disruption is not quite panning out that way. And in fact, the way that the blockchain is implemented very oftentimes ends up intensifying the property models or the property systems that frame the technology as such. And two very specific ways in which that is happening is, on the one hand, well, it has turned out that blockchain technologies are really quite good at creating this quite absurd notion of artificial scarcity in digital contexts. And I'll talk about that on another slide a little bit more. And secondly, that this technology that promises decentralization, that promises non-hierarchical network structures with very open and equitable access to information exchanges, to knowledge, to decision-making processes, well, they're actually also really, really efficient enforcement tools for things such as copyright. As such, I'd say, as a base layer for the conversation, I'd say technology lends itself quite well for perpetuating property models rather than really disrupting them. An example, and I'm mostly really limiting my examples to the context of digital art, because that's kind of a prime context for my research most of the time. So a good example of that is the many startups that are popping up, or that have been popping up, that are disrupting the art market or promising to do that. And really what they're doing is they're finding new ways of financializing components and aspects and different parts and dimensions of the art market. So a good example would be Mecenas. Actually, we had somebody from the Mecenas team on the Money Lab in London presenting. And it's a very interesting proposition and business model and platform, but essentially what it is doing is tokenizing art ownership, access to the art market. And this slide just shows a little bit of what their platform, how the platform operates. They fragment artworks, they kind of fractalize them, and then make these fragments available for sale to individuals who could otherwise never afford an Andy Warhol or what have you. But they might be able to afford fragments of this piece, and so they can buy those in auctions. They can then trade them and share them. And the assumption is that this ownership persists even beyond resale of artworks and so forth. And well, that sounds great, but it really is just kind of a hyper financialization of this entire process. To give a few examples from responses from within the art world to such developments, there's a number of really fascinating and wonderfully kind of critical and eloquent and really wonderful artworks that take up the technology on a structural level and really make what, very oftentimes is called blockchain art. And Jonas Lund and the Jonas Lund token is an example of that. I'm sure many viewers will be familiar with it, but I think it's a good example in this context, where this artist creates a token-based currency or system that allows audiences or whoever is interested, collectors, gallerists, curators, what have you, to essentially buy shares of not an artwork, but his art practice. And what that results in is what he calls a decentralized autonomous artistic practice, where the community of shareholders or trustees decides what the next project is, how it will be disseminated, which talks he should attend or not attend, which commissions he might accept or refuse. So again, it's a financialization of this creative process itself. Another example, and these are quite well-known examples by now, so I'll walk through these slides very quickly, is this project called Terra O, which is essentially a piece of land, a forest that is instituted or incorporated, I almost want to say, really, as a decentralized autonomous organization on the Ethereum platform. And so essentially it's an artwork that owns itself and that manages itself and that has, you might say, agency in how the ownership of the work and of the entire concept is administered, and how it evolves and how it develops. Again, a financialization of practice. So that really gets to the question then. Can this technology refuse property models or refuse property systems rather than perpetuating them in various ways, through other means? And I'm really not entirely sure that it can. And something that might be interesting for discussion afterwards would be, what does it do to artistic practice or to communities of practice when protocols, technologies, platforms of essentially hyper-financialization are embraced to the extreme, to the degree in which oftentimes they are. And to develop that question further, I have kind of like two ways of approaching that or of thinking about that. And this is purely speculative. The first question might be, can we imagine something as an unownable digital artifact? What might that be? How might that exist or function on the blockchain? What might it mean for something like that to exist? And unownable digital artifacts are maybe not an entirely new idea. I think it's not too long ago that many people, probably me included, naively assumed that a digital artifact is always unownable because it's so easy to copy and reproduce and disseminate. So it's just not an attractive commodity in that sense. And that's, of course, that was never really true, but it is even much less true now in blockchain contexts, because the ledger technology, distributed ledger technology, is just really very, very good in creating this idea or enforcing this idea of artificial scarcity. And I think this is something also that Jaya was mentioning a little bit earlier as well. What might this notion of unownability become or turn into when it's administered algorithmically? What kinds of agencies and subjectivities are really important to exist, whether it's a hacker engineer or a collective that operates a platform or distributes digital artworks in maintaining some level of, agency in running all of that. And my second way of approaching the question or thinking about this might be not to focus on object or the artifact as such, but more abstractly on infrastructure. And I think this is by far kind of the more promising and more interesting, but also much more complex way to approach this. And this is my last slide, Inte, and then I'm done. So how might a commoning of infrastructure serve to create or help this idea of unknownability to materialize on the blockchain? I put two examples on the slide here. Both are, again, quite speculative and in development and ongoing. One is a project called Culture Stake, which Furtherfield in London is spearheading, and which is essentially a blockchain-based voting system or consensus-finding platform that allows communities to collaborate in a very non-hierarchical manner in making decisions about cultural activities, cultural events. Somebody just stuck their head in the door. Sorry. Where was I? Anyways, Culture Stack. And the second example, quite similar, a bit more formalized. A project called DAK, the Decentralized Autonomous Kunstverein. And Kunstverein has a long history in the German art world as a system of non-profit, community-run art associations, or that are funded through members, that have bylaws that can be changed by the members, that collaborate on curation, acquisition, distribution of artworks, and so forth. And so both of these are examples of ways of creating community around digital art that are directed at an idea, a very, I think, progressive and innovative idea of digital commons. However, both of these run on technologies that are, as baseline, you might describe them as financial technologies, and that is potentially an issue again, right? Again, there's a financialization aspect in the background here that where I have the question of how that might kind of murk or trouble the waters of what these types of communities aim to achieve, namely operate maybe not entirely outside, but aside from very conventional property models that crypto platforms are generally meant to kind of perpetuate or enforce. And I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks for listening. I look forward to discussion.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, I think I'm actually seeing a really nice progression in the talks today. So I think your presentation gave us a glimpse of how the blockchain might be put to use to exist outside of the status quo, not just disrupt the next business sector. And I think that connects really nice to the last speaker, Max, who will touch on a topic that I kind of started thinking of as kind of alternative innovation. So also kind of thinking differently about something, that there are a lot of general ideas about, but kind of thinking it in another direction. So Max is Canada Research Chair in Culture, Media and Social Justice at Lakehead University in Northwest Ontario, and the Director of Reimagining Value Action Lab, Rival. And in his presentation, Max invites us to think about innovation not as finding fixes, finding technological solutions for whatever problem, but instead conceptualize it as survival, resistance, grassroots strategy. What can we learn from the refusal of those that have no other way to deal with a system that is stacked against them? Max, if you're ready, you can start.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a different chain of blocks today, which are these, which I'm sure will be familiar to all viewers around the world. One of the world's most ubiquitous commodities, ramen noodles, and I'll explain why I'm going to talk about them in a second. But I want to preface that by saying that I think my interest in blockchains is really about the place that they might fit in what Massimo De Angelis, the political economist, has framed as a worldwide set of rebellions over measurement under global capitalism, and a kind of refusal of the architecture of global capitalism that claims to be able to measure and value everything appropriately, and yet which almost everyone around the world recognizes does not value our labor, our time, our relationships, our capacities in any way adequately or fairly. And as part of that, I think my interest has been drawn towards asking not what are the forms of financial innovation, to use the term broadly, that are occurring at the sort of cutting or bleeding edge of technology and theory. I'm actually increasingly interested in the forms of everyday quotidian financial innovation that are being practiced by people at the very farthest margins of capitalism, those who've been excluded or rendered as surplus by capitalism, those who've never had access to technology or to the kind of infrastructures that would allow for the things that we typically valorize as financial innovation. And I'm going to speak about that in a moment with regards to ramen noodles and the economy that's created by incarcerated people in the American prison system. But before that, I guess the question I keep coming back to in trying to think through financial innovation from below, from the grassroots, let's say, or from the perspective of those excluded and surplused, is what is it that we, and who is it that we typically imagine is the ideal subject of financial innovation and of the use of money? What are the characteristics of the ideal agent, the person who has agency or access or use of these new forms of blockchains, of money, of other forms of technological innovation? And I think, in spite of the fact that these technologies are often quite useful in helping us think about other ways of valuing our time and our labor and those things that we share in common, in spite of how useful they can be in helping us develop also alternative models for cooperation and collaboration based on different ways of valuing time, labor, and measuring those as well. In spite of all of that, we carry with us a certain notion of the subject, of who acts in the world, that was born of the crucible of colonialism and capitalism over the last 500 years, and which is fundamentally shaped by those systems. And here I'm drawing on the work of philosopher Sylvia Wynter or Denise Ferreira da Silva, who point out that we carry with us, even in our understandings of radical alternatives to the status quo, a certain notion of who the political and the economic subject is that is ultimately the model of Homo economicus, the model of the self-actualizing, acquisitive, competitive economic subject. A lot of the discourses that are around trust or lack of trust within blockchain communities, if you can use the word community, and around new cryptocurrencies, I think are indebted to this fundamental thinking that we have that's trapped within this paradigm. And people are trying to break out of it, but still, as Ferreira da Silva notes, we are haunted by this sort of subject. And so my interest is thinking about, well, who are those within our global societies who've always been excluded from inclusion within this subjecthood? Who have always been told that you're not a good enough subject and you may never be a good enough subject? And I think the imprisoned population in the United States is a great example for reasons I'll get to in a moment. Where I'm headed with all of this is trying to think, what would financial innovation look like from the perspective of the undercommons, which is a term I take from Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, by which they mean those practices of solidarity, of care, of mutuality, of study, which is a kind of alternative to thinking about education, but a kind of grassroots form of study that exists through struggle. And specifically, they look to the Black radical tradition, the traditions of the Black Atlantic, to look for these kind of radical grassroots alternatives. And from that perspective, then we would think through the innovation around money from the kind of vantage of what makes life livable for people whose lives have been made unlivable and whose lives have been made worthless. That's the kind of question that I want to begin with when thinking about monetary innovation. What are the technologies that everyday people are inventing in order to survive an economy that is trying to murder them? So this takes us to the example of ramen noodles. So you may be familiar with the way that in prisons around the world over the last few centuries, since the kind of spread of the carceral logic of colonialism and capitalism, the cigarette has become a main currency where people exchange it in order to buy goods and services within a prison economy where typical forms of like legal tender are not particularly useful because there aren't stores and there aren't other goods and services you can buy with money. And where a scarce commodity like cigarettes, which have to, of course, either be smuggled in or bought through commissaries, become extremely valuable. Well, within the last decade in the American prison system, the cigarette as the kind of currency has been replaced by packages of soup like this for very important reasons to note. So for those of you outside of the United States who are less familiar with the context, the United States incarcerates 2.3 million people. 40% of those people are Black, in spite of the fact that Black people only make up 13% of the American population. And while an astronomical 1 out of 9 Americans will at some point in their life have and be incarcerated in the American prison system in one way, shape, or form, 1 out of 9 of the whole population, 1 out of 3 Black men will be incarcerated at some point in their life, and 1 out of 6 Latinx people. So there is an incredible racial economy of the American prison system. As Ruth Gilmore Wilson points out in her book Golden Gulag, this prison system, though it's not always for profit, although there are for-profit prisons, plays a very important role in sustaining and creating fixes for American capitalism. And this fix for American capitalism that the prison represents is one that is fundamentally based on what Dylan Rodriguez calls a warfare on racialized people. It is a form of economic, social, political, and physical warfare on racialized people, a term he proposes instead of the much more liberal framing of mass incarceration. So in those prisons, essentially what has happened is because of the replacement of food services by increasingly privatized food services, large corporations, incarcerated people don't get enough calories in order to reproduce their bodily health, especially in a context of great violence where you need to bulk up often in order to survive. And so ramen noodles become extremely useful because they are a prepackaged, universal, fungible form of food that you can get exactly to 190 calories from. It lasts forever because it's made out of enriched wheat flour and palm oil. And it can it's interchangeable. So you can accumulate them, you can trade them. So incarcerated people in American prisons have begun to use these and innovate new forms of currency practice through something that they can access through prison commissary stores, although at a huge markup. So for instance, in a prison, this might cost $3 or $4 American dollars, when at wholesale prices, it might cost 3 or 4 cents. In any case, here's what I want to take away from the example of the ramen noodle economy in prisons. The first is that I think when we're thinking through monetary innovation, it's, as I mentioned, it's important to begin with those people who've traditionally and consistently been excluded from the capitalist economy and from the technological advances of money within the capitalist economy. Not just excluded by accident, but excluded by design, in the sense that their exclusion is the basis on which the economy is built. The second thing I would want to ask us is to take from the prison abolitionist movement the important question of, to what does the prison offer itself as a false solution? So the prison says this is a way to deal with people who've done bad things in society, but of course it's a false solution to that problem. I want to ask the same question about money. To what does money propose itself as the solution? What is the social problem, and who got to define the problem in the first place? And I think we'll come up with very interesting answers if we start from this question around abolitionism towards money. And the final one is that I think that as we think through financial innovation and the possibilities of new technologies, it's always it impinges upon us to think through how such projects can contribute to grassroots forms of resistance and rebellion of people who are being devalued and made disposable by the dominant economic system, rather than thinking through how can we design alternatives to it from the top down. I think beginning with the question of resistance and embodied resistance creates a whole new horizon for very interesting discussions and arguments. That's it.
Thanks, Max. The first thing that really comes to mind for me here is kind of connecting what you talked about, the prison, and then thinking about the blockchain. Is a project called Bail Block that I think maybe some of you are familiar with, that kind of puts a blockchain to use and asks people to kind of install a program on their computer that runs in the background, kind of using blockchain to generate money to put to bails and get people that can't afford bail, getting an automated system for people to use of. So maybe that's something interesting to think about. But before I kind of wanted to ask a question that is really about what for me is the kind of central idea of this panel. So can blockchain technology help us imagine and work towards a more equitable, open, flexible world? This is, for me, the central idea. So on the one hand, it seems like blockchain can become many different things as long as we design it well with by the community. It could be empowering. It has activated many people to organize alternatives. On the other hand, these fundamental critiques that we've also heard, they remain coming back about the economics blockchain performs, the property models it supports, things that Jaya and Martin mentioned. So will blockchain in the end just reconfirm the status quo, or what does it mean that this question always seems to remain open? It doesn't really ever fall on either side. It keeps inspiring those that want to build alternatives and equitable society, but then there's also these critiques that remain. I wonder if someone has thoughts about that.
Well, I think the game is still very much open. But for me, I guess I'm just less kind of concerned about blockchain per se, and more fascinated by the questions that it keeps putting on the table. And I think like it's really in the questions that it puts on the table where the potential continues to lie, right? So kind of foregrounding all the kind of otherwise boring and backgrounded stuff of financial infrastructures, of the nature of money, the nature of databases, the politics of information infrastructures. It's a kind of technology that keeps putting those questions on the table and hasn't managed to resolve any of them particularly yet. But I think that has value in itself. And I guess there's lessons being learned, and I think they're broadening the scope a little bit to not just kind of blockchain as such, but distributed ledger technologies more generally, and cryptography more generally. Just the kind of awareness that's been created around cryptography and cryptographic techniques, and what role that plays in defining power dynamics and in digital infrastructures, I think is all very valuable and very promising things.
I would totally agree with that. I think I'm on the same page on that as well, that the blockchain can absolutely help us imagine these alternatives and divergent approaches. But can it help us implement them and realize them? That I'm not so sure about. But I also think that all the bad implementations help to render the technology as kind of a conceptual drawing board on which problems are mapped out, and where a lot of experimentation happens, that often hints in the right direction, even if it stays at a conceptual level.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think
suppose-
it's been. Sorry, I don't want to jump
No,
in,
no, go
Max, but just to say, just to say that I think this has been the kind of like wonderful and entertaining aspect of blockchain technology, right? Is to see how lessons are being learned about finance, politics, infrastructures on in like fast forward, right? It's like some big lessons, like hard lessons being learned, and in kind of like very quick succession in ways that, you know, if you look at kind of traditional institutions, there is like historical memory of social struggles and so on going back, you know, hundreds of years. And some of that is kind of like, it's like a, you know, the weird experimentation that's happening in blockchain partially opens up for new angles on that, partially also is a kind of like relearning of some of the same historical lessons, let's say.
I suppose for me, I mean, I'm fairly skeptical to the idea that blockchains in and of themselves can necessarily be a force for equity and equality. I don't foreclose the possibility that they might be tools that might be used within broader struggles for those goals, but I again would want to frame them as tools. The thing that I think maybe interests me a little bit more is like who needs optimism of blockchains, and whom does optimism around blockchains ultimately serve? I wonder, you know, like ultimately we could say like, yes, these technologies have incredible potential to allow us to organize social life very differently and organize economic life very differently. But the kind of idea that they will be a force of change strikes me as an optimism that ultimately would reproduce, has a much higher likelihood of reproducing the systems that we're already in rather than new systems. So I'm always curious about like the uses of optimism and the limits of it too.
I mean, I think most platforms that are in a, you know, later stage of implementation prove your point, Max, that they don't they could be these tools, but oftentimes they are not. Virtually, I think pretty much every platform that wants to revolutionize the art market using the blockchain is totally a symptom of that. Sorry, I think there's maybe a bit of a lag. I cut off Jaya. Sorry about that.
That's all right. No, I was just going to say something similar. That yeah, I agree that so far it kind of tends to reproduce in oftentimes a very kind of cliched ways, kind of neoliberal ideology, but. I think the obvious reasons for that is that actually it takes quite a lot of work, quite a lot of theoretical work, quite a lot of personal work, quite a lot of like political and community work to kind of actually develop alternatives and understand the critique that is required at this point. And so, you know, it's not something that will just kind of emerge naturally in the technology. It's, you know, the technology is being developed by us with, you know, our kind of, you know, if we haven't read a lot of social history of political struggles, if we haven't read a lot of critical theory, if we haven't, you know, then yes, the tendency will be to reproduce, you know, some kind of banal assumptions of what we think economies and money looks like or should look like. So yeah, it takes deliberate work, and it takes and I yeah, don't expect the technology to be any kind of quick fix on anything on that front. Having said that, there is an incredible historical moment, I think, right now where the level of kind of legitimacy or obviousness of the continuity of neoliberalism is like in a major crisis point. I think everyone's like, oh, you know. So there is an appetite to actually look for other ways of doing things, and there's also an incredible appetite for looking back at history. You know, looking back at how the hell we got here. So yeah, there was something else that you mentioned, Max, in your talk that made me think of. You know, I think approaching economic or financial innovation from the margins is also, to my mind, an important strategy of also a different type of anti-capitalist work, let's say, where it's not, you're not continuously focusing on analyzing what is capital doing now, but more on analyzing what are the already existing alternatives, what are the already existing ways that people deal with things. And, you know, it kind of reminds me of the like diverse economies stuff that Gibbs and Graham kind of develop, and this idea that they're, you know, post-capitalism or non-capitalist economies already exist, and they have always existed. It's just that they are squeezed more and more, and so kind of like that's a piece of kind of knowledge work in itself. That's a piece of kind of like bringing that knowledge back into bear, I guess.
One other thing that in Max's talk actually got me thinking about the blockchain also is his reference to the undercommons, and where they talk about this idea of a prop. Wonder if you remember, Max, that they describe like kids use toys not because a sword you can only use as a sword, but they say a sword is what you hit a ball with and a bat is what you make music with. And they describe that, that there's, and here I kind of quote something, there are these props, these toys, and if you pick them up, you can move them into some new thinking and into a new set of relations, a new way of being together, thinking together. In the end, it's this new way of being together and thinking together that's important, not the tool, not the prop. And I wonder, can blockchain be such a prop? To not get too obsessed with the actuality of what it might do or does, but to let it guide you to other ways of thinking instead. I wonder if this is something that resonates with the panel, or
I mean, it resonates, but it that's not what's happened, unfortunately.
No,
I
but
think
can it be?
Yeah. I think with the I really don't know. I mean, I'm skeptical as well at this point. You know, after all these years and the way things have kind of played out. But you know, I think by drawing out, you know, in the work that I try to do, I try and kind of draw out the specific bits that I do find useful and that I do think can kind of change the way that we are together. And you know, cryptography, to my mind, is a pretty major one currently for the future of digital type spaces, you know, and digital communities. And of course, blockchain. You know, there are interesting things that blockchain can do in terms of making quite advanced cryptography more available to ordinary people, and just increasing awareness around those things. But yeah, blockchain as such is like, as an ideology, as a symbol, the kind of culture around in the developers communities, I'm not quite sure. There are a few nice and friendly spaces. But there's a lot that's like, oh, you know.
I find it a bit resonant with I think that discourse in Moten and Harney around toys and props is really, really fruitful. And it brings me to mind of research I did some years ago when studying financialization of children's play with Pokemon cards, which I know are global commodity, so maybe viewers around the world will have encountered them. They're cardboard cards based on Pokemon characters, and allegedly there's a kind of game you can play with them that's sort of like Magic the Gathering, the collectible card game. But many children collect the cards and play very different games than the game that's provided to them by the corporation. And in my study of this and other people's study, the argument is that essentially these cards, in spite of the fact that they have a kind of corporate game attached to them, and they're obviously like a kind of proto-commodity that children are encouraged to buy and accumulate and you know, indulge in as a financialized practice, children actually play with them in completely weird and different ways that the game designers couldn't have possibly imagined. And they develop repertoires of incredible economic and social creativity through this prop or this toy. I think there is the potential for those who are attracted to and committed to notions of building new blockchain technologies and the associated values around those, like autonomy, cryptography, as Jaya was mentioning, that could bring together communities who then focus on other things. But I would also want us to contend with the fact that, like, the blockchain communities are often organized largely online. They're often organized in ways that are based on a kind of competitive, accumulative logic. And so I wonder if we would be overly optimistic if we were to think that somehow they would sort of morph into other kinds of political or social communities. And similarly, if we'd be overly optimistic if we imagined that the tool that they produce could be toyed, to take that noun and put it into a verb, like could be made into a toy that didn't have the same purposes for which it was initially built, which is to say replacing a neoliberal economy with the competitive, as still competitive, accumulative, individualized model. But I'd love to be proved wrong.
I feel in particularly the last few months now that exactly this conversation has gained like a new kind of valence because conversations are moving online, have had to be moved online, have had to be moved, like just as the conversation we're having right now is happening over distance and so forth. And so that aspect that you highlight, that these communities are organized around also distributed collaboration or participation. Until maybe a little while ago, I would have, my perspective on that was kind of that I don't think that's a benefit or that's a total advantage. I think that's also something that obstructs collaboration and actual community. And so the technological, the protocol-based promise of a trustless way of interacting is not that attractive if I want to create a collective or be part of a collective and part of a community to some extent, under some circumstances. And so I wonder how that perspective or how that conversation is changing now that we have been forced into distanced modes of communication and collaboration. And I think so also the stakes of protecting the integrity of data flows or information flows or the privacy dimensions of conversations that people are having is for me anyways, like bringing back some of the promises and stakes of distributed ledger technology in quite interesting ways that are maybe more promising than they would have been before this pandemic lockdown that we're all kind of dealing with still.
I think it's time to move on to the questions from the guests, but also before we do, I just want to remind everyone to quickly, last moment chance, ask your questions in the chat. First, we'll go to Knišiška in Ljubljana, where we have a few invited guests that ask some questions to our panel. And then afterwards, it's the audience questions. So, yeah, on to you.
Hi, let me introduce myself first. My name is Martin, just like Martin that we have on down there. I'm an academic professor. I teach blockchain economics. So I am interested in the economical aspects of what blockchains can and will be able to do. I've heard many interesting suggestions and topics here discussed today, from hackers to economizing the prison system. I knew about the cigarettes, but I never knew about the ramen noodles. So that was a quite interesting piece of information. However, what most fascinated me personally is the concepts mentioned of unownability, which were mentioned by my namesake also, Martin. And coming from a background where the blockchain is used primarily for the purpose of establishing ownership of anything, starting with money, and then of course people have tried to use this for everything else, and as you mentioned, owning pieces of art instead of just a whole piece of art. I would like to hear or understand this the applicability of this concept, either through examples or just some philosophical trail of thought, where why would something be unownable, and so what would be the purpose behind it, and how would this be useful in either the short or the long term? Thank you.
Well, that's one of the questions that I mentioned in the beginning. I'm not entirely sure how to answer. But if I begin, if I approach it from just a very fundamental, maybe reconsideration of what the blockchain imagines itself to be for, then as you described, I think very well, it's about defining and enforcing and perpetuating certain kinds of ownership relations. And now, if if such a technology at the same time promises me that it will disrupt global finance, then I'm already confused, because it seems like it's better set up to actually strengthen or amplify or intensify finance. So from that perspective, I'm just very curious, what could it really mean to actually use that technology, or try to anyways, as a tool to disrupt what it is meant for. And if what fundamentally it lends itself to is the perpetuation of ownership relations, then that to me means like, well, the disrupting that at a very fundamental level would be to inject into that system maybe infrastructures or objects, artifacts that just don't make themselves so easily available for entering into ownership relations. Now, what could that mean in terms of more practical examples? I did some research a while ago that draws parallels to conceptual art in that context. And in the history of conceptual art, there is quite a large number of approaches and works and practices that seemed to be designed exactly to try and achieve that. Create artworks that you can't own, that you can't sell, that can't be traded, and so on. And oftentimes these would be in some way dematerialized, or they would exist in the form of a contract, or in the form of a verbal agreement or a set of instructions, right? And so conceptually that seems, or it might sound like it might work quite well, but in practice, that has not ever been the case, right? And so, and you can read very amazing and fascinating kind of commentary by conceptual artists about their own frustration of recognizing that the dematerialization of art that was their life's work actually resulted in the art is the most pure commodity imaginable, and essentially played, in the agenda or pocket that they tried to oppose. So I know that's not an answer to your question directly, but I think it, it's for me a good starting point as maybe a cautionary tale or a cautionary story or history of how these kinds of resistant practices can be co-opted and assimilated into their opposite quite easily. And I can imagine extensions of that into a contemporary moment where, somebody might want to attach smart contracts to digital artifacts, which will, let's say, maybe every time some kind of property enclosure of a digital artifact is detected, the smart contract will trigger a mass number of reproductions of that artifact, or new ways of disseminating it that might actively resist that property enclosure that it hasn't detected. I'm not very hopeful that might work or might do anything. And in fact, that's, as I think mentioned earlier, exactly what the blockchain ledger systems are really really good at documenting and counteracting. Like almost every art market blockchain startup will tell you right away on their website that their ledger is an amazing way of ensuring that you will always know everything about the provenance of each digital artifact, that it will be digitally scarce or artificially scarce, regardless of how many times it's been reproduced. So it will be absolute. I mean, that's the promise. It will be ownable, right? And that will be desirable as a piece of property. Right, that's the question I want to kind of open up from the other way around. Yeah, I don't think there are examples that would already demonstrate an answer to what you're asking.
Could I suggest a couple, perhaps?
Please do.
So I think another useful way to look at this question is to kind of contrast, the idea of private property with commons, right? With the commons, and the idea of the commons as being a kind of set of resources that's managed for the benefit of a community by a community, and where the need for private property over that commons is not required, right? People have their needs met in a different way. And so that sets up a bit of a kind of like ideological battleground, let's say, private property versus commons. And you do see blockchain projects who emphasize the commons, right? Who want to kind of like create tools for the commons. And I think like when it comes to a kind of commons-like understanding and approach, again, to go back to kind of like earlier history of decentralized network technologies, and also what you mentioned briefly in your talk, Martin, the idea that, at one point, this idea that like information wants to be free, this idea that the digital world is a world that's infinitely reproducible, and so to impose scarcity is a kind of like false thing. There is still remnants of that culture very much at play in blockchain, especially when you look at things like the code base itself. So blockchain projects, from kind of like purist perspective, it must be open source, and that comes from, on the one hand, a kind of like a security concern, but on the other hand, also from this idea that code, should be forkable, it should be reproducible, people should be able to innovate, working on each other's advances in the space. And then I think another interesting way of looking at unownability in the blockchain space is the ledger itself. Who owns the decentralized ledger itself? That's kind of, the whole point of the project to some degree. So I think we're seeing like different dynamics. On the one hand, blockchain is the perfect tool to reinforce private property and property relations. On the other hand, there is also this other dynamic at play at different layers of the architecture. And for sure, also a kind of cultural and a longer kind of historical tendency that does draw on kind of commons-like ideas.
Thank you. I will leave the floor to the other guests, if you don't mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Marina, and I'm a legal designer. I'm a researcher, and I advise startups, but I also work with projects that are doing research in the blockchain space. So, for example, one of the recent we have done is EU law and blockchain. I have a question for Jaya, but maybe also for everyone. It was very interesting to see your presentation, because we could also see what happened in the last 3 years, for example, or the last 4 years within this space. And also, so speaking about projects and startups, I have worked with one that you mentioned today, for example, and I know how this was done and how they were designed in 2017, for example, and what is happening right now and what is the difference between that. And I think that there was a lot of uncertainty 3 years ago, for example, when I come from my place and from my my studying, it's especially the legal uncertainty was very, I would say, risky for the ones that were courageous enough, and we can see the consequences right now. And right now we have more clarity, also thanks to researchers like you, and also thanks to governments giving us feedback on what is, what can we do within the legal ecosystem that we have right now. And what I have observed is that if the projects want to work in a way that you were mentioning, being more equitable, working, against these big platforms that are owning our data, they are actually building new systems. It's not just new startups, it's not just new business models, but it's a very big systems, and with the I would say rhetorics that we're using also in the token engineering community, building a new complex system. So designing something that is so complex that you would need much more time, and I would say also money to build. So it's very hard also for projects to do that. And my question is, what did we learn in the last 3-4 years? What would you say to the projects that are working right now? Maybe, I don't know, researching more, having more diverse teams, working with researchers like you are, because it is a very hard task for them too. Thank you.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the amazing things to be researching in the blockchain space is that there is actually, in my experience, and at least in the European context, there is an incredible openness to critique. There's an incredible generosity with researchers, and kind of desire to learn quickly and to kind of move quickly. And so, but so your question is, what has been learned in the past
what
few
should
years?
They do? Yeah, what should they do, and what has
do next?
been learned? Yeah.
Well, I think that first of all, like I said earlier, we're in this kind of very interesting moment historically right now, where there is a lot of mainstream skepticism towards business as usual, and that also includes the question of control over information infrastructures. And so, in the European context, you've got things like GDPR and stuff like that, that is very much about, bringing control back to who? Sometimes it's very much focused on the individual. We must bring control, people should be able to decide on their own data. At other times it has kind of nationalist or regionalist kind of industrial interests behind them of like bringing control, industrial, financial, and innovation control back to the European space, as opposed to the US controlling these infrastructures or whatever else. But so what I think is happening right now is a very kind of strategic moment for people wanting to build alternatives to cloud infrastructures, especially. A strategic moment, meaning there is a lot of goodwill from policymakers and regulators, and also more kind of like mainstream general public interest. For me, the real key though is to develop this kind of layer in between, right? That has to do with a kind of community layer, maybe at a municipal level, maybe at a kind of social movement level, maybe at, there's various other forms, but, kind of this space where, and once again, I think that's like quite a kind of interesting aspect to the kind of hacker engineer culture, is that it is a space that is where it's a community that's defining itself, right? Rather than kind of it being, this kind of neoliberal individual, rather than it being a kind of a public or a political community that's defined by a state. It's a kind of political community that's trying to define itself, trying to kind of like, I think that's something that is, when it comes to, the next step in information infrastructures is like absolutely where things should be headed. That was a number of things off the top of my head. And apart from that, I think it sounds like, generally it feels like there is, there's very good research coming out right now. There's much more collaboration between the kind of like innovation, entrepreneurial space and researchers and academics. There seems to be kind of closer collaboration with social scientists as well. So, Does that answer your question, or is there more?
No, thank you very much. I would just add that there's also more collaboration with lawyers, so this is very positive.
And more collaboration with lawyers, yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey. Hi, my name is Miha Artnak. I'm an artist and a designer. I did come across blockchain with, of course, Bitcoin, and then I just started to make fake news about it and created a so-called Bitcoin city in Slovenia, and it actually exists now because from my utopian idea, it became kind of a dystopian capitalist appropriation of this idea. But nevertheless, it dragged me into research, but still don't forget, I'm not a professional. My theories have holes, so I fill them up with imagination. And I would like to say about your optimism. Who's it optimism? What's the optimism serving for? You said that, Max, right? Well, I think it's really hard nowadays to not be a pessimist. I was an optimist for quite a while before everything collapsed. And I think optimism is supposed to be utilized just to get the ideas across. And I was thinking about, since we have, I don't know if you noticed, Shopify merged with Facebook to create Libra again. It's back in the game, and I'm wondering from the different points of views about the situation. Is one is corporation having everybody on board and making their own monopoly money. Then you have China, it's like a state, not a corporation, doing the same. And then you have Venezuela, where there's peer-to-peer, just like it's supposed to be in the beginning. But they, of course, they were the last on the wagon. So it's just poor man to poor man. It's not peer-to-peer, actually. So I'm wondering, from these three perspectives, what's the alternative, actually, if there is one? Since the topic is radicalizing the social imagination, I'm wondering if we could create some. This is where my not complete understanding of the blockchain or the possibilities begins, but I'm just trying to create a debate that maybe if you add like contracts or the game, the law into the whole game, you might add like ownership or inheritance or monopoly or maximum wealth and universal basic income, just like a contract that is divided into to all citizens of the world, not just corporations or Chinese, but if that would be possible, where would we start? That's kind of my naive perspective on it, because I want to inflict optimism to this debate.
So the idea of encoding a different politics into blockchain, into smart contracts and so on, basically. And, I think there's good projects that try and do that. And definitely things like universal basic income. There are projects like Circles is trying that out at the moment, and a number of other things. And to me, it seems like what you very quickly realize, like blockchain, it creates this kind of temptation and it creates this kind of excitement that like, oh, we can just re-engineer everything, right? It's like, here we have this tool and it's going to be networked, which means it's super powerful, which means that if we just change the code a little bit like this, then all of a sudden, boom, we've got a different way of doing the economy, a different way of doing finance, a different way of kind of running our society. And the funny thing is that, like, actually, technology doesn't quite work that way in practice, because there's the hard practical problems that come about in, making it actually usable, making it actually scale in the right ways, or scale in terms of kind of in the good ways, let's say. And so, one thing is the good ideas, and then the other thing is like, will those good ideas be adopted, and is blockchain necessarily always necessary? I mean, sometimes it is just. Sometimes it's a problem of organizing rather than a technological problem. And so, the easy technological fix is not. These things can be very useful, absolutely, but they're not a quick fix. Although it does, there is that temptation, because when you see something like Libra, you're like, oh my God, Facebook, a change in Facebook is a change for 2 billion people, And so it's this idea that like, oh my God, if we can access that power, right? If we can just create a kind of like alternative to Facebook, but it's like, there's been, I don't know how many alternatives to Facebook that's been developed in the past 10 years, and like what's been adopted. I mean, so you realize that that's not quite where the problem lies. Like, it's not necessarily just in the code where things will be decided and where the kind of new society can be engineered. A lot of it is like hard problems of organizing and of political and economic power, and yeah, that's my not so optimistic answer. But I am hugely optimistic. I am hugely optimistic about things in general right now. I think there's like incredible social movements happening that have been long time coming, and it's some of them. These years right now are some of the most inspiring. Really, it feels like a true rupture, rather than a symbolic one.
Mm-hmm. True.
My optimism. Oh.
Yes.
My optimism in some way comes from the capacity of not only these technologies, but also the movements that Jaya is speaking about, to not only demand of us questions about how we're going to distribute wealth in society, although that question is very important. I think the potential of the technologies is to help us reorganize how we cooperate. And I mean that in the broadest possible sense. On the narrowest level, I mean that in terms of how we are able to cooperate individually, or on the level of firms, or on the level of nations. How do humans apply what maybe we used to call labor to transforming their world, and how do we organize that? And right now we have a global free market system, allegedly free market system, that's to say a market system that organizes people's labor and cooperation in horrifically exploitative ways and with incredible unequal consequences. I feel the really interesting potential of these new technologies is to have methodologies to organize human and non-human cooperative energies differently, beyond a kind of free market system. And that's where I see the most excitement for me around any of these technologies, is how are they enabling people to cooperate and make things differently? How are they enabling communities to provision for themselves differently, to meet their needs? How are they being used to allow people to see, understand, and interact with non-humans, like computers for one, but also other non-humans in the world, like the things that we call nature, forests, rivers. And I know this is sounding a little bit abstract, but I think one of the things that our moment is generating, including the rise of these new technologies, which are forcing us to think differently about goods, services, labor, and cooperation, is a revisiting of some of the fundamental categories of what we understand an economy to be. But my optimism ultimately is not that we're going to create one true and good blockchain to rule them all, but rather that people will start to seize upon these technologies in order to enable themselves, their communities, and their constituencies in some way to reorganize cooperation, labor, and wealth. And that through those grassroots efforts around the world, we could then build up into sort of structures that might actually replace the global capitalist marketplace within our lifetimes.
Does that answer your question?
I would love to hear Martin's opinion also.
Okay. I'll maybe pick up quickly on the point that, or one of the points that Max made about potential other subjectivities or agencies that may not be human, and that these technologies through computational or algorithmic interfaces might be able to draw into conversations or decision-making processes, whether it's nature, so different ecologies, whether it's animals potentially. I think that is really a direction into which I would love to see more optimism channeled as well. In a lot of kind of crazy digital art that works with maybe financial technology on the one hand and artificial intelligence or machine learning on another. Very often that is partly the focus to open up relationships, whether they're ownership relationships or other types of maybe decision-making processes or participation models, open these up to agencies that are not the well-defined, well-understood, long-standing participants and agents in economic systems that we have big problems with. So that is that I think is that warrants a lot of optimism. That last, or another added direction into which these platforms could maybe move us, opening up kind of towards post or trans or not otherwise non-human agencies that become incorporated as well.
All right, that's it.
Thanks.
Thanks.
So I think now we have some questions from the audience. We have some. Yes, Nika is there. Yeah, go ahead.
So, the first question comes from Real Daniel, and the question was asked at the end of Jaya's talk. So I guess, but maybe everyone could answer. Could you mention any examples of existing blockchain projects that take a more equitable approach to decentralized accounting?
So, like I said, I think distributed ledger technologies are slightly more interesting than blockchain as such when it comes to this, or just to my mind of the other projects that I know. And I think, like economically, I think holochain is one of the most interesting ones. So yeah, I'd recommend looking at holochain.
Anyone else or answering this question, or continue with the next one? Okay, I'll continue. The next one is from Aude Lunet, and it's a question for all the guests. What do you think about the fact that in order to interact with the decentralized autonomous organization, or DAO, as empowering or aimed at doing good, this, I'm actually not sure if it's DAO or DAO, that this could be or would seem to be, that one needs to own Ethereum. So the main question in a way is, what does it fundamentally mean for you to tie voting power to a currency?
Yeah, that's I think that's a really good question. I think it's a super interesting question on a lot of different levels. I mean, you could look at that economically, which is like super problematic when you have a kind of like currency that fluctuates hugely in terms of value, and then that it's supposed to have, very particular kind of like use values in terms of internally running an organization. And even DAOs aside, people that are trying to develop other kinds of dApps, decentralized applications using Ethereum, face this problem of volatility and not being able to kind of assess the future price. And there's a whole bunch of kind of economic tools and I'm losing track of the vocabulary in the space in the past couple of years, but there's all kinds of ways that people are trying to kind of like hedge the risk of the volatility, and try and kind of make Ethereum kind of more useful. So that's like, let's say, on the kind of practical and economic and organizational front. But there's also obviously much deeper levels to a question like that, of what does it mean to tie voting to money as such. And I think even outside of the blockchain space, there's been this idea that money is a form of voting. And so therefore buying things is a form of democracy, which, you know, I think is like a kind of like perspective on things that's like quite kind of rife in the United States, less so in Europe and other kind of political contexts. But if buying things is a form of voting, then surely everyone should have equal votes, right? So that puts a different spin on that question.
I mean,
I'd be curious, Max, to hear. Okay, there you go.
What were you going to say?
I was going to say, I'd be curious to hear you relate that back to the prison economies around, you know, commodities that are on the one hand very controlled, like ramen noodles, but that also come to embody economic meanings and powers, really, that are maybe unintended. Anyways, maybe,
yeah, I think it's a really curious conundrum, because on the one hand, like the one thing I would say, historically speaking, is that the idea that democracy should be limited to property owners is the origin of at least Anglophone democracy. Like that was what the British Empire was built on, and the American Empire too. And it was only through kind of mass movements, notably by poor people and by women and by people of color, that ever changed. So the idea that people would casually accept going back to that is, in a word, deeply reactionary. But that said, I think it also maybe reveals something about the limits of what we consider to be democracy too, because even the form of democracy that we have in many places is a form of slightly expanded representational democracy that is really just about a check and a balance on tyranny. Of a kind of like centralized state, which is not really democracy. It's basically like the democracy of being on a train and having access to an emergency brake, but not the democracy of actually being able to go where you want or choose your fate. So I think there's a lot more to be explored in terms of how these technologies could offer us different models of democracy, but basing it on the ability to buy in through a currency, I think, is a terrible idea. At least in terms of a utopian promise. I think the flip side, though, is that if we look at the ramen economy in the prison, we see that people create economies as they need in order to meet their needs in extremely hostile environments. And I don't think that that's necessarily, that shouldn't necessarily be seen as akin to a kind of democracy. It's, you know, it really has to do with a kind of solidarity and competition within a circumstance of artificial survival. But there are moments when these things turn over, you know, when the prison ramen economy turns into these acts of solidarity, mutual aid, and ultimately then different forms of democracy as people need to make decisions together about their common fate, especially, for instance, when you have the ramen economy somehow turns into a prison rebellion, and you have a situation where prisoners are actually managing their own lives within these conditions in a moment. So I think there's just lots of interesting ways that economies and democracies flip over into each other that we could map out and would be interesting to think about.
I mean, I'm guessing there's also more to that question in the sense that, like, in the blockchain space, you know, there is this whole idea of having skin in the game, and, you know, you should, if you vote on something, it should matter enough for you, and that somehow kind of putting some economic value on your vote will somehow kind of make that vote more true to where your values really lie, because it will hit you on the pocket, kind of thing. But again, you know, I think there's a lot of analysis and work to be done on understanding how that plays out in practice rather than in little game theoretical models. Because, you know, in practice you have lots of other things going on, lots of other kinds of incentives that are non-economic, and huge inequality in terms of access to tokens, to money, and differences like this. I think you should not, to speak in more concrete terms, you should not underestimate the psychological difference of having a shit ton of money and having very little. It affects, it affects a lot of how you end up behaving and your attitude towards money. So there is no kind of like level playing field, or no kind of like neutral interaction with tokens as such. Is actually deeply historical, deeply racialized, deeply class-sized, or deeply class-based, and so there's lots more going on, let's say.
So I go to the third question. Yes. Or, yeah. Okay. It comes from Eric Berry, and it's a question for all of you. So I'm just going to read the whole paragraph. I'm interested in this notion of market-resistant property. It would seem that when we remove marketability from an object, the logic of the market swoops in and devalues our labor. Vis-a-vis the remix movement and data wants to be free. While we don't want to simply reproduce the conditions of the market, perhaps there's a way of building pockets of resistance into current market conditions. Short of trying to invent an entirely new economy like ECSA. That's the question.
So ECSA is Economic Space Agency. Most likely is what he's referring to.
Yeah. Just trying to find it in the chat to get a bit of a. It was a long paragraph to get a bit of a sense here.
I mean, I can read it again if that would help. So it's related to market-resistant property, removing marketability from an object. The logic of the market swoops in and devalues our labor. Relating all this to remix movement and data wants to be free. And then at the end, while we don't want to simply reproduce the conditions of the market, perhaps there's a way of building pockets of resistance into current market conditions, short of trying to invent an entirely new economy like ECSA. Yeah.
So perhaps it's about how blockchain could have these pockets instead of trying to, or any other technology, instead of trying to kind of make the whole, like the one true chain, or, the new system, instead go for more like localized, situated approaches. But I'm understanding it a little bit like that. So I don't know. Yeah.
Maybe we could just start by picking up of this reference to remix culture, or also this notion of kind of data as a common good that maybe wants to be free or something. I guess before I moved into this conceptual space, a lot of the work I did was on copyright issues and IP issues. So this is something that I'm interested in, that resonates with me. But over time, I feel like I've really started doubting that remix culture as such was ever a viable way of resisting the marketization or commodification of cultural artifacts at all. In fact, very oftentimes, especially in the most popular contexts for kind of remix practices and remix artifacts, I often find that the cultural practices in those fields, in those spaces, play actually along with the rules of the market very well. I mean, sampling is something that only works conceptually if you, on the basis of it all, accept the assumption that the sample is part of an appropriated, other kind of cultural artifact that you reuse. So it's kind of a bit of a layering of ownership claims and some of them are disrespectful or are in violation of others. But none of them really negate the assumption that the artifacts in questions are subject to ownership claims. That's the part that confuses me maybe a little bit about the question, because I really wonder what a market-resistant piece of property could be. Resisting, what does it resist? Does it resist, is it not desirable as a commodity? Does it resist selling or trading? This all goes into a direction of kind of a speculative unownability. But what really is it? What really could it be? I don't know.
Any other responses to this?
I suppose I would just, like, on a theoretical level, I would pose that the system under which we live, which is to say a form of sort of global neoliberal racial capitalism, is one that depends on resistance in the same way that any useful electronic circuit depends on what could be interpreted as various forms of resistance. And that those forms of resistance are places where heat and friction are generated as well. So I think the notion that spaces of resistance altogether are a place to invest our hopes, I think would need to be nuanced a little bit. I think what we would need is to determine what is it that a space of resistance, whether it's organized on a blockchain or it's organized on a block of houses or it's organized in a voting block, what are the qualities of a block that would make it such that it not only represented resistance, but also revolutionary potential? And that to me would mean that it would need to be animated by values that fundamentally allowed people to cooperate differently and to withdraw their labor and their dependency from capitalism on some level. And it would mean that it would need to envision, at least at some point in the future, how it would make connections to other such blocks writ large in order to capsize that system from below. And I think what we often have, unfortunately, are forms of resistance that are about survival within the system. And I don't blame people for that. We all have to survive. But the problem is that I think any innovation within capitalism and the reproduction of the capitalist system as such on a global level always comes from the spaces of resistance, which then become laboratories for the renovation of the system as a whole. And I don't think that process is ever simple or one way or direct, but I think it's just a very important warning. So yeah, I don't have a very good answer, but these would be the questions I would want to ask.
I wonder, because we're kind of approaching the end of the event, and I was just thinking maybe there's something positive someone wants to end on. Otherwise, I will just round it up. For me, it was a very positive experience anyway. Yeah, Max?
Well, I just want to return to what Jaya was saying. I mean, I think we're in incredibly exciting times. There's a worldwide set of rebellions going on. The last 2 or 3 years have seen more social movement activity around the world, demanding peace, justice, and equality than we've seen in generations. I think it's a very, very exciting time, and there's lots to focus on that's positive. I'm reticent around wanting to have a kind of cruel optimism towards just blockchains, but I would be so curious how a new generation of technologists, of designers, of thinkers who are coming literally off the streets of these struggles devise mechanisms to take the baton from previous generations and see if any of these technologies can be useful in helping building a different world. I think, yeah, I'm so excited to see what that looks like.
Thanks, Max. I'm excited.
Yeah, no, I completely agree as well. And for me, a really important pointer in that area is that what this is about really is other ways of doing things. And I think it cannot be understated. It cannot be stated enough that the possibility for real difference and diversity in terms of how we organize our societies, that is like the truest form of anti-capitalism, the truest form of kind of revolutionary kind of progression, both in terms of technology and economics. Diversity is super key, and it's easy to lose track of that in technologies that are so dependent on scale of a particular kind, which is a kind of relatively uniform scale. And I think there's other ways of thinking about scale, and there's other ways of thinking about decentralization that brings in the question of difference a lot more, difference and diversity, and the ability for people to self-determine to the extent where, exactly as Max was mentioning earlier, really decide how they want to cooperate. And cooperating is a deep aspect of human society. It's not just like, how do we most efficiently design a kind of communication system in order for transmission of needs and offers most effectively. Those systems themselves have a qualitative effect on how we live together as a society, and can look very different.
Thanks. With that, I think we've reached the end of the event. And thanks for all the interesting questions from the invited speakers, but also from the audience. For me, it's been very inspiring, and especially like thinking about the current moment and how, we can think about economies and alternative organizing right now. That's super useful. So I want to thank Jaya, Martin, and Max for your contributions. And I really recommend anyone interested, to learn more about the political and cultural dimensions of financial technologies and the design of money, to look into their work. There's some great stuff that they've published and talked about. Again, just want to thank Aksioma as well, and good luck with the next and final ML8 session. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks. I would like to thank you all, including the guests in studio and the online audience, for your valuable contribution to the debate today. And at the same time, I would like to take the opportunity to invite you to the last streaming event of the ML8 series. Martin Nadal and Cesare Escudero-Andaluz, power Zeilinger of the Nascent Studio, Telekommunisten members Dimitri Kleiner and Baruch Gottlieb, and the Slovenian artist Sašo Sedlacek will be with us to discuss value extraction and the workforce of the crypto scene, with the moderation of the independent writer and curator Aude Lunet. The panel will take place on Monday, June 29th at 5 p.m. Central European Time at aksioma.org/ML8. The ML8 program is a co-production between Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art Ljubljana and Kino Šiška, done in partnership with the Institute of Network Cultures from Amsterdam and in the framework of Cons Platform for Contemporary Investigative Art. Thanks for being with us today, and see you next week.